slēgtā izstādē Tornis un kastes. Un šodien mums nākamā sarunu sesija, kurā piedalās Kirills Kobrins un brītu arhitektūras kritiķis Owens Hatherleys. Un šī saruna ir veltīta mūsu izstādei un veltīta jaunai grāmatai, kurā drīz iznāks un kuras priekšpārdešanu mēs atveram šodien internetu veikalā Talk.lv. Grāmata sauksies Baltika postkards, Baltijas atklātnes. Sveicinām Kirillu un sāksim sarunu.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we'll start. Unfortunately, I don't speak Latvian, so we'll go on in English. Hello, Owen. Owen is in London, in Western London. Yeah, it's western part of London.
No, God no. No, never.
Never.
Southeast.
Southeast. Sorry.
I've lived southeast for 21 years.
Yeah, southeast. Yeah. Actually, I forgot because I left London several years ago and forgot completely the geography and topography. Yeah. So first, several words about the background, or where am I now? It's a very interesting place. First of all, the residential area. Its name is Jugla. It's the outskirts of Riga. It's the end of Riga. It's been built in 60s, 70s, 80s, and some of the buildings in the 90s and in the beginning of 2000s. So it's it's the best possible place to discuss modernism, Soviet architecture, and so on, because you can find absolutely no traces of so-called old Riga and all the stuff here. It's middle of not nowhere but everywhere. We are in the middle of modernist Soviet, some kind of post-Soviet everywhere, and that is extremely important. And now I'm sitting in the abandoned cafe. Its name is Alex. It's been closed 1 year ago, not because of COVID and so on, but just because I don't know the reason why they decided to sell the space and so on. But no one so far bought it, and that's obvious because of the pandemic and so on. And it still has all the design of 90s. It's essential 90s, with the stars, with the Bordeaux walls, with typical sort of pseudo Art Deco armchairs and tables and whatnot and so on. And this is the place where we decided, not me, not we, but actually Vladimir Svetlov and Arbita group decided to organize a sort of forbidden exhibition, photo exhibition dedicated to Soviet modernist architecture. As far as I understand, initially the idea was to open the regular exhibition of photographs and so on, but because of the lockdown and so on, they decided to redesign it into a sort of online event, which is full of not just the visual things, but DJs. One of the DJs, by the way, the first one who played the first day. Today is the third day, as far as I understand, of the exhibition. So the first day started from their DJ set by DJ Jugla, and this is the name of the residential area where we are. Speaking frankly, I've never been to here. I have been living to Riga for 3 years, but never been so far from the center. And of course, I never been to this cafe. Secondly, there are 3 photographers, actually 2 photographers and 1, as far as I understand, contemporary artists. They show their works. One is a photographer who lives in Lisbon, and there are the pictures of the modernist Portuguese architecture from buildings from 1970s and 80s. Very interesting examples of it. As far so actually, I am not specialist, but I think it's pretty interesting. The second one is a series of photographs dedicated to the elections in Latvia. In the small town, a small Latvian town, as usual, electoral board or commission, they sit in school or sport institution or something like this. So they're empty, post-Soviet, very clean, very empty, and very boring places, spaces where one or two members of this electoral commission sitting, and it's a sort of idea of the elections in post-Soviet space as a extremely scarcely populated event in some sense. And the third one, it's an animation on this wall. It's a project by a very romantic modernist architect, Latvian architect from 1960s. His name is sorry. His name is her name is Marta Stania, and she decided to erect a tower in Grizinkals. Grizinkals is well-known part of Riga. I spent there 2 years. It's a former proletarian area full of the abandoned or closed factories from from Russian imperial period and partly Soviet period. Sorry, you told me that it's Grizinkals. Anyway, this is a very impressive, very romantic tower, which is surrounded by the typical Latvian landscapes with bushes, with the kals and small hills and so on. And the tower itself is very impressive and never been constructed. So everything is drawing us to the topic of our talk, and the topic is the topic of the whole exhibition, tower and the boxes, and the idea of the image of the modernist and mostly the Soviet modernist architecture today. It's unexpected trendiness, its legacy, its survival in our times, and and a very interesting thing, which I hope we would start from, is its coziness. Somehow this intimidating architecture, or how it's been considered as intimidating architecture by those who prefer the more regular stuff built in Art Deco and so on. Now it looks like very cozy. It looks like, especially when it's snow now in Riga and so on, it looks like, Ironia судьбы или с легким паром. All these Soviet movies about the cozy Soviet life with the mild humor and so on. So my first, not the question, but first point is that modernist architecture, especially Soviet modernist architecture, is becoming trendy today. It's not like just such things like this book of photographs of Soviet bus stops, which became a sort of bestseller in the English-speaking world, or some coffee table books with Soviet modernist buildings in Armenia or Georgia or something like this. No, the very idea of social housing, modernist social housing and social architecture, which been hated for many decades, is becoming more and more fashionable, trendy, especially in the sort of middlebrow bourgeois mainstream culture. So how could you explain this?
I think it's a long story. And I think there was always a kind of first phase of this, which was just focusing on the kind of spectacular architecture of that era. And, all the kind of coffee table stuff began with that. And there was almost a kind of like, I think like fashion often works like this. And you could see it exactly the same in the way that 19th century architecture was kind of gradually kind of reassimilated. Is that first we were kind of like, particularly in Britain, but I think elsewhere as well. It was like, okay, well, we can admit that some of like the colleges or like the churches were good. And it was like, oh, maybe some of the industrial buildings were good as well. And then it kept going until eventually it was decided that Victorian housing was good, which was completely unprecedented. Before that, before the 1970s, pretty much everyone had universally decided that Victorian housing was trash and that should all be destroyed. And there's a kind of crushing inevitability in a way about the fact that this then happens with every single era. And I think the process here has mirrored that almost exactly. Like the kind of like the kind of rediscovery of Soviet architecture began really while the Soviet Union was still in existence in the 70s and 80s, when researchers both within the Soviet Union, like Selim Khan Magomedov, or outside, like Catherine Cook or Natalie Kopp, like rediscovered constructivism. And then, there was the kind of discovery in the kind of 2000s and 2010s of, the kind of very, very out there, kind of spectacular or kind of individually designed building in the republics. So seldom in Russia, seldom in Ukraine, actually, usually in the Baltics or in the Caucasus, sometimes Central Asia. And often those books have a kind of like, unlike the housing, which was trash, this stuff was brilliant. And you kind of, one kind of knew that eventually they would get round to, and the housing is good as well. So on some level, it's just kind of like fashion, and is as interesting or as uninteresting as fashion always is. But there are more interesting things, I think, at work. And there, I think, some of it comes from things that are specific to former kind of state socialist Europe, and some things that are kind of more global. So the first of those, I think, is the fact that, and some people may disagree with me on this, so I'm do so if you want. But my understanding from kind of researching this stuff for about a decade is that these places were not particularly segregated in class terms in the USSR. That if anything, actually getting a flat in a newly designed kind of Brezhnev era housing development was something that you would get if you were a skilled worker, if you were an office worker, if you were relatively privileged in the system. And in a lot of cities, that it would be rather the kind of, the still being in communal housing or in dormitories is something that poor people would have or younger people would have. And that kind of concrete panel housing would be something where you would get, the family of a doctor and the family of an office worker and the family of a skilled worker, but not necessarily, a building worker or an unskilled worker, but, someone that was a skilled factory operative might be in that. So it was always more difficult in a way to kind of present this in the way that particularly American kind of thinkers had as ghettos. And to kind of, American public housing, and I don't think this is actually true, particularly. It's not true of New York, but it's true of some cities. Chicago, I think, is the big one. A lot of American public housing really was ghettos. It really was a matter of ghettos in a lot of places. There was a lot of racial segregation. There were specific laws in the US that only some groups could live in public housing, and that public housing could only be built up to a certain standard. It couldn't compete with the market. So it had to be built at a lower standard. So there, the kind of American critique, which was hugely popular in Eastern Europe in the 90s. Like you hear, there's so many examples of kind of people in like 1991, 1992 saying, we're going to have to destroy all of this housing because it's terrible and it's ghettos and it's evil. But they would then be confronted with the fact that in a lot of cities, this is where most people lived. And where most people lived who were often middle class. So there was this kind of, it was just a different experience. And I think people kind of began the 90s with a slightly kind of cargo cult thing of like, everything that the West say is happening, everything that West do is what we should do. And there was a gradual and still, I think, unfinished process of realizing that this was dubious, that actually, these areas had their own history, which is quite different, in some ways worse, in some ways better, in some ways just different. And that you couldn't apply insights from Chicago to Riga. You couldn't apply them to Warsaw. It didn't make sense. You were dealing with something different. And so in a way, that housing was easier to kind of then go to, to kind of stir nostalgia about, the nostalgia from like Eldar Ryazanov films, or that kind of 70s kind of warm Brezhnev stuff that you talk about. That was kind of easier to do because so many people had experienced this. Whereas in the US, and to a lesser extent in the UK, the amount of people that had lived in high-rise housing was much smaller, and it was much more limited to a section of the working class. So it was really kind of class terms and race terms in a lot of cases in the US. Just wasn't the case in somewhere like Riga or Kaunas. That just wasn't true. So that nostalgia, I think, then gradually has an effect that people are like, oh, well, actually, we like this after all, particularly because there then comes a question of what do you do with it? Do you renovate it? Do you demolish it? Whatever. And the other point, which is about a kind of more global question, is the lack of cheap mass housing in most of the world in the last, really in the 21st century. Obviously, there's exceptions to this, as Kirill knows well. Obviously, a huge amount of housing is built in China, but there's the idea of low rent public or even non-public or cooperative housing built en masse, accessible, straightforward, is really, which would have seemed very banal, very ordinary at one point, is if you're 25 years old and you live in London, or Barcelona or New York or Moscow, incredibly exciting. There's this idea that, wow, this really, this could have been provided. The state could have given you this thing at like 6% of your income, and then you would have just lived in that. And in cities where 60% is more generally what people pay out of their income for rent, that's genuinely quite unusual and seems something that people think they might want to have. So I think there's a kind of, that's the sort of nostalgia that I think happens not really in smaller towns and cities, but places where there's a big problem with property speculation. There's a lot of nostalgia for that housing, which you can see in the way that, like, the kind of Khrushchevka campaign in Moscow a few years ago, as an example, where housing that was once considered very banal is being defended quite kind of strongly because of the fact that it's the only affordable housing.
There are 2 points which you figured out, and we'll discuss them a bit later. But before, I would like to propose, the logic of our conversation. Let's start from analytical point of view, and then let's go to romantic point of view. Analytical, first of all, you introduced us to historicism in this subject. We discussed, or you told about the different different types of social housing, modernist social housing in Soviet Union, or in Soviet socialist republics, in the United States, and so on. That's absolutely true. It's interesting that the buildings could be, relatively similar in different countries. And I remember my first visit to Netherlands in 2001, when in Rotterdam I found out absolutely same buildings which I used to see when I was growing up in Gorky and so on. So those were extremely interesting, extremely powerful act of recognition, of understanding that I'm living in Europe. And that is, by the way, one of the main topics of your book, Trans-European Express. We are living in Europe not just because we had ancient Greeks, or Rome, or Christianity, and so on. We have, most of the continent is full of the modernist social housing, from Urals to Portugal and so on. It's actually, in some sense, it's the same space with different meanings and so on. And that is, our next step. I absolutely agree with the thing you told, that the most important thing is not the architectural shape of these buildings, but the content, the ideology which is behind these buildings, and our understanding of this sort of architecture. In Soviet Union, in socialist republics, and so on, these buildings, they were part of the huge project of building of the state of so-called social justice and so on. We cannot say that everything been built because of that was a communist utopia. It's not true, because in 1970s there were not no any traces of communist utopia in Soviet Union, by the way. That was just a pragmatic gesture, because the most of the population was living in the pretty harsh conditions, and they should be settled somewhere, and that is all. It's not about utopia. When we speak about Bauhaus, it's utopia. When we speak about constructivism, it's utopia. When we speak even about the early Stalinist architecture, it's still in some sense utopia. But and even Khrushchev times, yeah. But in 1970s, in 1980s, it's absolutely different approach, and we should understand this. But when we look closer at the situation, historical situation in the Soviet Union from 1920s or 1930s to the end of 1980s, we see absolutely different approach to the idea of the of social policy in this country. Some I'll share sort of personal stuff. I was born in and spent the first 36 years of my life in Soviet city Gorky, then Nizhny Novgorod, and so on Avtozavod district, automobile plant district, which been built in initially from the scratch in the beginning of 1930s, and it is the oldest part of Avtozavod district. Is a very interesting example of Stalinist early Stalinist architecture, 1930s, and that was not the representation of the social policy of 1920s or, for instance, 1960s. That was a very gradual, very class segregated, actually, approach to who will live there and there. All these beautiful Stalinist buildings in Sotsgorod 1, Sotsgorod 2, been usually that was for the best engineers, the best doctors, and some of the high skilled professional workers, and that is all. Most of the population, they lived in so-called baraki. It's not barracks in England. In English, it's it's just a shacks, communal shacks. And I still remember in 1970s this sort of housing still existed somewhere, and I remember this. I remember that the Avtozavod district consisted of Stalinist architecture, then Khrushchev architecture, then Brezhnev architecture, early Brezhnev architecture, and baraki and the shacks and so on. Then, step by step, in 70s, they just wiped these shacks, communal shacks, been wiped out, and the new building, been constructed and so on at these places. So it's not the idea of utopia; it's just a common sense, and that is all. So we see that social policy in Stalin's times, which Stalinist regime, been built on the idea of inequality, not the it's the main social groups of the population, which been the social base of Stalinist regime, not just NKVD guys and so on, but the high profile and skilled engineers, scientists, office workers, and the very, very narrow part of the working class, and that is all. And then after Stalin's death and so on, then Khrushchev came in, and he absolutely changed the social policy, because the 1960s, especially the first part of 1960s, was a sort of remake of Soviet 1920s. In different times with different, background and so on, but the very idea was utopian, and that was the last utopian period in the Russian and Soviet period, and that's why we have Khrushchevki, which are really populated with absolutely different people from different social groups and so on, and this sort of policy been prolonged during Brezhnev times and so on. Of course, different approach we have in the United Kingdom, we have a different approach in Germany or Netherlands, and which is different not just from the Soviet Union but from the UK as well. And we have this ghettoization of working class and ethnic groups in the United States and so on. So my point is that when we speak about all these nice modernist buildings and so on, we should speak mostly, because I'm not architectural critic as you, I'm historian, mostly about the ideology and history which is behind this. And then aesthetic ideas and so on is a sort of sub-product, side effect of this. And back to the trendiness and that this sort of architecture is becoming more and more fashionable and so on. Public opinion today, in neoliberal public opinion, is just stealing the forms, aesthetic forms from the time, trying to just strip them definitely of the ideological, political, and whatever class content. And that is extremely interesting, because this is absolutely the same thing which was happening, for instance, in the end of 18th century with Gothic architecture, when early Romantics, they stole Gothic architecture without any idea of what medieval life was about and so on, and brought it to their mindset or ideas and so on. So in some sense, yes, this is never-ending story of detournement in some sense, of all these architectural forms and so on, without any understanding, any historical understanding. That's why I claim that we should all the time we should remember about history when we speak about this.
Yeah, no, I agree. Although the bit about neo-Gothic is interesting, because of course the theory precedes practice in neo-Gothic, right? That in the 19th century, people like Pugin are kind of like, has the famous book Contrasts, where he has the page of the classical city, based on pictures of Newcastle, I believe. The classical city, which he makes to look like kind of like barracks and prisons, and it's heathen, it's pagan, it's unchristian, it's ugly, it's industrial. Classicism is industrial for him. And then there's the Gothic city with the beautiful spires and craftsmanship and godliness and so on. And then, of course, what you then go and do is you then build it. You then try and build your imaginary city. And that certainly happened when, in especially richer cities like Moscow in the 2000s, obviously the Christ the Savior Cathedral being reconstructed, a huge amount of architecture of the Luzhkov period being kind of like very, very poor imitations of Tsarist architecture. Whereas this trend that we're talking about, there is no building project. There is no kind of like in a city like Riga, there is no neo-Soviet architecture. There is no one trying to kind of emulate the architecture of the Brezhnev era in real buildings or even in building projects. And I think that's an interesting distinction. If you do see anywhere in the post-Soviet space at all where they are trying to build a kind of Soviet architecture, it was in Luzhkov's Moscow again, with the Triumph Palace emulating the Stalin skyscrapers, or various examples of it actually, and even going up to quite recently. There's a huge building off Tverskaya that's kind of the pyramidal and the kind of, well, they're much more elegantly detailed than the Lushkov stuff.
So you're speaking. Sorry for
There's a copy of
interrupting
that
you.
in Astana and so
Sorry
on.
for
So
interrupting
that's
you.
so, but bear with me. So that Stalinist architecture is revived, but the kind of Khrushchev and Brezhnev architecture is not revived. If it's revived purely by historians and by young people on the internet. So why is it that the building industry and architects themselves are so uninterested in emulating it?
Yeah, but I think you are speaking about this building by Patriarche Prudy, which is very interesting.
I'd write about that, yeah.
It's a Stalinist building with the Tatlin tower just on the top, with the sculptures, with everything, and so on.
Yeah, there's the sculptures of the property developers.
Yeah, and this is the best representation. I think it's a great building actually, because what's architecture is about, if we are not speaking about from aesthetic point of view or professional and so on. It's a representation of zeitgeist. 100% essential representation of post-Soviet Russia 1990s is this.
If you want to know what Russia in the 90s was, you can look at that building.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is a useful thing. But anyway, so what kind of intrigues me, I know loads and loads of architects in Poland and Ukraine, for instance, who are fascinated with the architecture of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but they would never be able to build anything like it. There is no revivalist project to build things like it, which is a really interesting thing. I think that no one really thinks we could do it, or even that we want to do it. And that's where I think the untidy link between aesthetics and history comes in, is because I think to the kind of rising groups in those societies, they might want to, in Astana or in Moscow, they might want, sorry, it's not even called Astana anymore, in Nur-Sultan and in Moscow, they will try and evoke the architecture of Stalinism, because that signifies, as you say, luxury, class segregation, power, privilege. And that's what they want their buildings to show. Whereas for a building to try and show the values of the Brezhnev era, which are basically a sort of interesting combination of like technocracy, social conservatism, and inequality. Like there are no forces in society that would make that would like make a kind of mass housing like that. So it stays purely at the level of historians and hipsters.
It's interesting that my late friend, the philosopher Alexander Pitigorsky, who spent many years in London, and before this he had been living in Moscow. He is typical Muscovite. In one of the documentaries, I think that was Latvian documentary, Philosopher Escaped. He's reading a sort of monologue. He stays by one of the Stalinist buildings. I think that was Kotelnicheskaya набережная, Kotelnicheskaya. And he was speaking. When I was a boy not a teenager, in the end of 40s, I was absolutely crazy about this architecture. Yeah. Not because it was beautiful or something like this. No, for me, when I was 15 years old or something like this, that was a representation of the idea of power. The real people with real power live in the best possible conditions in the post-war Moscow, and that was the idea, which is the thoughts which been in the head of the 15 years old typical Soviet teenager. He was not a philosopher at that moment, and so on. He was just sharing his ideas about this sort of architecture, and that is true. And I absolutely agree with you that why did Stalinist architecture became a sort of mainstream thing, not mainstream in the mass construction, but in the minds of those who are living and constructing and paying money, investing, and so on in Moscow and partly in St. Petersburg in 90s, and till today, it's interesting that the idea of Stalinist architecture as something extremely interesting, important, and which is a real representation of everything we like. And for instance, Khrushchevki is a representation of everything we hate. And that
and
what
everything want to leave as well, everything want to escape from. And that's where the kind of like the sort of social mobility aspect comes in. Like, you know, if it's just the equivalent of the Victorian house, you know, the thing that everybody lives in, if you want to express any sort of distinction, you have to escape that. You have to escape the Khrushchevka, you have to escape the Brezhnev housing, and you have to get to something like Moscow in the early 50s. And there it goes back to their Western sources. And I always insist on the Western sources of these. Like, I know that, Kirill, you're a skeptic on the Russian avant-garde, but there is literally, you know, there is a moment in the 20th century where where Russia and Eastern Europe is at the vanguard of the creation of new forms and new ideas in architecture. And it's from about 1919 to about 1932. And after that, it follows at every point. And you get interesting things that happen. I mean, you know, the metro is being an obvious example, that there's no real equivalent of the metro elsewhere. But for the most part, it's based on other forms, usually from the West. So this era, which is seen as the most kind of like insular, if you like, is actually the one where the form is being borrowed most obviously. So if you look at, you know, the building on the embankment in Moscow that you mentioned, or the Hotel Ukrainia, or the Academy of Sciences in Riga, these are modeled on New York architecture of the 1910s, Chicago architecture of the 1910s. A building like that is the municipal building in New York, or the Woolworth building. The apartment buildings are modeled off the buildings on Central Park West. Like I can't remember what they're called, the San Remo or something, with the Twin Towers. Mm-hmm. I remember the first time I was in Moscow, which was many years after the first time I was in New York. Sorry, first time I was in New York, which was a long time after the first time I was in Moscow. Just finding it hilarious how much New York architecture looks like Stalinist architecture. Because there's a direct borrowing, and it's luxury architecture and an architecture of power, which is then reappropriated as the luxury architecture and the architecture of power of Stalinism. And something very similar happens with the kind of prefabricated architecture of the 60s and 70s. That the source for all of that is France. The source for all of that is a particular building system which was used in the suburbs of Paris, particularly in the housing estate Sarcelles in north of Paris, which was taken over lock, stock, and barrel completely and used to build almost every Soviet housing estate from a particular French model. And the way that those French estates are planned as well is very, very similar. Their kind of grid plans and their green spaces is modeled one-to-one in things like Novye Mushki and so on from the late 50s onwards. So there is this process of borrowing, and this process where something that's actually Western is understood as the most Eastern thing. And that always intrigues me, that you would take a tourist from like Birmingham to Riga, and as they come in through the airport, they will look at the housing and they will think this is typically Eastern European, and actually what it is typically French. And I find those kind of processes of misunderstanding fascinating, and it suggests that what's actually being made is a value judgment. And East is just used as a value judgment to be kind of like, you know, bleak and technocratic and horrible, and Western is something different, as if everyone in the West lives in classical buildings, of course, which is not the case. So yeah, it's a sort of endless process of misunderstanding on everyone's part.
So that were not Scots who invented everything; they were French, yeah.
French and American.
Eventually. But it's interesting the connection after discussing the historical context of this topic and so on. It's interesting to move to another aspect of it, the connection between this architecture and utopia. there is a delusion that utopia could be only sort of communist and so on. There are a lot of utopias in this world. There were a lot of utopias in this world and so on. And in some sense, we can say even about the spiritual utopias of some of the religion sects and so on in America, by the way. And I never met, not being a historian of architecture, of art, or something like this, but when I spent the whole autumn in the state Iowa last last year. Oh no, it was not last. 2019 already. Yeah. And just walking around the small town where I've been living, there is a extremely interesting building, the bank, built by one of the representatives of so-called Prairie School, which
Isn't that run by Louis Sullivan, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
It's one
Like
of
your actual inventor of modern architecture, Louis
yes,
Sullivan.
yes, and it's interesting. I started reading, of course, about him and so on because there's nothing to do there actually. So I I started being a sort of local historian, and there were a lot of books and other materials there and so on. The connection between Prairie School and the first skyscrapers in the United States. And I found out that it was not just a sort of technical stuff or architectural stuff, it's spiritual stuff, because a lot of them, they were believed in socialism in some arts and crafts way. Some of them, they just believed in sort of Christian God, but in a very American way, and so on. And, the foundation of this architecture initially was a mostly spiritual. They tried to construct something really beautiful from this point of view. And I could cautiously, but I could call this point of view utopian as well, because sort of American idea, American dream is utopia as well as communist, and so don't forget about this. And that's why we cannot, write down Soviet architecture just because this is utopian. Utopia is dead. That's why this architecture is just, a static phenomenon and nothing more. No, 20th century, the end of 19th century. Don't forget that you're speaking about arts and crafts movement, and before this, Pugin and so on. But it's interesting, the connection between their spirituality, their, the idea of socialism, the idea of spiritual whatever, and so on, the conservative understanding of history and so on. But at the same time, these people who believed in the uniqueness of every piece of art, of design, and so on, they were really, as William Morris, the real founder of the design industry in the United Kingdom. And that is very interesting, the connection between the industry and the idea of something unique, something spiritual, something, beautiful from the capital letter, and so on. So the very idea of beauty in bourgeois period became sort of dubious. On one side, it's a pure beauty of all this decadent and late romantic stuff and so on. But on the other hand, it's just an industry of beauty, and that is all. So I think back to Soviet architecture in the 30s and then and after that and so on. I think it's not fair to underestimate the not utopian but sort of spiritual idea of social justice, which laid the foundation for this. For this country, where with a huge gap between rich and poor for many, many, many centuries and so on, to believe that we can settle, all our population in decent flats and so on, it's not a utopia. It's a sort of pragmatic, but on the other hand, it's sort of spiritual. It's sort of religion. It's a pragmatic religion, but this is a religion. And of course, communist idea is dead. Communism was, communist regime was sort of one of the worst in the history, and so on. Everyone knows this. But don't forget about the how this utopian vision been applied to everyday life, including the construction, including the intention which been behind this construction, or the, this approach to architecture and so on. That's why Soviet Union um, borrowed the forms from French architectures, or whatever and so on, but the transformation which been made with all these ideas, it's not visual sometimes, because the quality of construction was very poor. That is, we should admit, and that is one of the main problems of this. You cannot compare, Paris buildings with Nizhny Tagil buildings, not because it's Paris and Nizhny Tagil, because of the poor quality of construction. That is all.
Well, no, there's not just poor quality of construction. The other question is one of scale. Mm-hmm. And I think that actually this is, as they say in Poland, where the dog is buried a lot of the time. It's just that a lot of the kind of feeling that people have of whether or not they're coming from outside or not, of intimidation, comes from the scale and from how much of it there is. And that is really one where you have to kind of, I suppose, I don't want to kind of get us into too much of a digression, but I think this links up with another misunderstanding that I think is very much, that's quite important, which is about the kind of idea of underdevelopment or backwardness in Central or Eastern Europe. And of course, the idea of backwardness is highly dubious. There's a lot of Orientalism and all of this and so on and so forth. But one of the reactions people made in the 90s a lot of the time was to say that they were made backward by communism. And of course, what we all know, anyone that's read any history whatsoever knows, is that, the urbanization and industrialization of most of Central Eastern Europe happened under communism. Their kind of technological period, their enlightenment in many cases happened precisely in that era. If you're talking about Romania or Lithuania, or even Hungary, or certainly Poland, and so that's why there is so much of it. There's a huge amount because of the fact that cities doubled in size routinely, and you don't have actually Western cities, Western Europe, in that period that double in size. Yeah. Maybe a little bit in Southern Europe. Athens is a really good example, and they do things quite differently in Athens, which is an interesting side issue for another discussion another time. But the cities double in size, and so you have to build for 500,000 people, let's say. Nowhere in France or England or Germany has to deal, maybe Germany a little bit because of war damage, has to deal with the question of building for 500,000 people. St. Petersburg built for 500,000 people, more than that. Bucharest, Riga, frankly, although Riga's one of the more developed cities before 1945, but actually, it did double in size. And so you then had to build loads and loads and loads of this. And so you have this combination, and I think everyone really knows this, that you have this combination of, on the one hand, the size of the problem and the bluntness of the instrument with which you solve it. So you build kind of concrete blocks on a grid to house an entire city, basically. And so the results of that, people already knew in the 70s were a problem. The aesthetic results of that were a problem. That the scale was so repetitive and so boring, and the construction quality was so low. This is why it's not brutalist, and certainly people often talk about brutalist Soviet housing estates. Like, brutalist architecture is when you have truth to the materials. Everything in the Soviet period was generally clad because the concrete was so bad. So you then have this problem of, like, you're dealing with something where, although the source is actually France and Britain most of the time, the scale is so much bigger than anything that would have happened there. So you then have this completely different question. And that's why I think one of the things that actually you don't see in Riga, although you do see it in Ventspils, is the question of changing their aesthetic while keeping their form. And I was really quite shocked once. I think the first time I went to Riga, I've not been back to Riga in about 3 or 4 years. But the first time I went there, just the fact that the Soviet housing hadn't been renovated. And in Warsaw, it's all been renovated. In Tallinn, it's all been renovated. In East Germany, even in lots of Romania, most of it has been renovated.
In Czech
You have
Republic
a layer
as well.
of styrofoam, and then you paint it in pastel colors in order to make it look less monolithic and less kind of brutal than it is. But at the same time, the actual functional thing that it's doing stays exactly the same, and it works very well. Like, it works very well. There's some people that are snobbish about this, and they're kind of like, "Oh, I don't like the colors. It's so kitsch." Like, fuck off. Like, it's actually does something very, very useful. It makes that housing secure and safe and properly insulated, and at the same time, like, it makes it feel a bit less bleak to people. It's good. But the explanation as to why Riga didn't do this, and I don't know if it has since, but the explanation I was given when I was asking people was about heating bills and about wanting to keep heating bills high. If you don't insulate the blocks, people are still paying a lot more for the heating, and that in some way was considered. Anyway, I don't know enough about municipal politics in Riga to say about this, but I was very surprised that the stuff was untouched.
There's legislation about property here is pretty strange and so on. That is another. Okay, so we are just wrapping up our conversation and so on, and you just reached the final point. How could this sort of architecture survive?
Well, I mean, it survives much better in the places we're talking about than it does in Britain, let's say. And again, this comes back to, and certainly a lot more than in America. And this again comes back to the question of how much there is of it. If you were to say in Riga or Bratislava, or we're going to demolish all of the Brezhnev housing, you would be having to rehouse about 200,000 people, at least.
Yeah.
That's simply not possible. That's simply not possible. Unless you have an economic boom that is far bigger than the economic booms that those countries have had, unless you have a kind of state capacity that is far bigger than those countries have had. You just can't do it. And so that's why the EU, which is no friend of socialist projects of any kind, has given lots of money to those countries
into this renovation.
For renovation, because of the fact that actually, it's very, very difficult to get rid of, and so it's much easier and much more pragmatic, to use that word again, to say, well, let's just make it nicer, which is a good idea, I think. So that and that's not, in somewhere like Chicago, where a huge amount of that housing was demolished, it housed a minority, so you could do that. And even then, it took them decades. They've tried to do it in Glasgow with awful effects, for the same sort of reason. And I think that's partly, again, because of the fact that the people who are doing, partly because there's less of it, and partly because the people who it's kind of being done to have less of a voice. You can do something in Chicago that says, fuck poor black people, we don't care what their living conditions are, we're going to make them homeless. You can do that. You can't say, we are going to rehouse half the population of Riga. You can't. It's not possible. So that, I think, is a lot of it. So I think this stuff actually does have a future, and I think actually the high densities of it is actually quite, and the fact that lots of it has a lot of green space, is actually suggests that it's not that bad a model. And it's like one of those things that my favorite lines ever on Soviet architecture and 20th century communism in general is Deng Xiaoping, when he was asked by Oriana Fallaci about Mao's mausoleum. Because he'd been quite critical of Mao and of the Cultural Revolution and so on. And Mao, of course, himself didn't want to be in a mausoleum. And it was like, do you think then that you should remove Mao from the mausoleum and demolish it? And Deng says, it was incorrect to build it, and it would be incorrect to knock it down.
Yeah.
And I love this. I think that's the 20th century experience in a nutshell. That no kind of ecological thinker now would say, let's do this. But looked at now in an ecological way, a lot of that housing is very good. Demolishing it would be an ecological disaster. The amount of carbon that would be wasted would be huge. The amount of concrete that would be wasted incredibly foolish to demolish on an ecological level. And because of the fact that it's still connected with these kind of late 1920s, 1930s ideas about green space and open space, they actually tend to have a lot of trees. And, ecological thinkers have been spending the last 30 years, and particularly the last 10, going, there needs to be more trees in cities because you need to have oxygen in there and you need to lessen pollution and so on. That was one thing the Soviets got right, was, you need a lot of trees if you're going to deal with pollution. And they tend, in some cases, although not all, to be reasonably well connected to public transport. Varies from city to city, but a lot of them have, a tram line or some sort of rapid transit that gets them around, that connects quite well to that area. But that varies hugely. Certainly the case in bigger cities. So actually, there's no reason why in the 21st century you would want to demolish them, other than as a kind of ideological gesture of like breaking with the past or whatever, or, decommunization or what have you. Other than on that very ideological level, it's all pretty useful. But going back to the point earlier, what you won't see is anyone saying we should do it again.
So the humble outcome of our talk is that, the way of surviving of this architecture, which is, common sense, it survives and will survive and so on. It's a meeting point of the idea of social approach, if you want socialist approach, and European bureaucracy, like in European Union.
Yes,
so God save European Union and so on. So
I'm from Britain.
I'm joking, of course, but actually, the moderate pragmatism in these things is the best solution for this, and that's why I consider this, returning to the starting point of our conversation, I consider this, fashion or trendiness of this Soviet architecture as pretty dangerous, because it's just about aesthetic form. It's not about the content. It's not about people who live in these houses and so on. And okay, let's video directors, shoot their music videos on the background of their as a door doing this today and so on. But mostly, let's speak about the common sense and not about the, big ideas about beauty from the capital letter. Thank you very much. For those who are just watching our translation, Owen's book is forthcoming in Arbita publication in Latvian. It, hopefully will be published in 1 or 2 months and so on. So for those who read, for those who read in Latvian, that will be, I'm sure, a very good example of a different way of thinking about architecture, urbanism, and so on, than people in post-Soviet space used to think about these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.